The Japanese warriors of the Kamikaze transferred the U.S.-American forces in the last months of the Second World War in the Pacific, in hitherto unknown fear and terror. The word kamikaze comes from the Japanese language, and means translated, the divine wind. Splitting the word kamikaze, kami means the divine and kaze means the wind. Where did this myth of the divine winds come from in Japan? Was this just propaganda of the Japanese government in World War II, or it was an ingrained legend in Japan, which has existed for 800 years? The kamikaze were a special force of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force during World War II. These combat troops, whose pilots were mostly volunteers, were killed by their suicide attacks against the ships of the United States Navy, against the British ships of the Royal Navy, and against the ships Australian Navy, known in the last years of the war 1944 and 1945. When the military situation in the Pacific became increasingly hopeless, the Japanese decided, pilots under the Bushido Code, to dive-fly their machines into an enemy ship. The fuel and ammunition stores on the ship's deck were as handy as a powder keg. The young Japanese pilots saw it as a disgrace to be captured by enemies, and preferred death to imprisonment. Where did this fanatical belief in dying for one's country come from? And the second question that needs to be clarified is why the elite pilots of Japan were explicitly chosen for these suicide attacks on American and Allied ships. In this video I tell you the story about the kamikaze. Here we go. The word kamikaze existed in Japan long before World War II even could start. Centuries earlier, in 1281 AD. In this year, Mongolian forces were commanded by a general, served under Genghis Khan. His name was Khan Hulaya. He and his Mongolian army were attacked by a tropical typhoon storm, and destroyed when they sailed to Japan. Thus Japan was saved from being taken by the Mongols. By what is believed to be a divine providence saved. By fortuitous circumstances, or as believed by the Japanese of the Middle Ages, divine providence, the legend of the divine wind was born. At the end of World War II, the divine wind came at the right time, from the point of view of the Japanese. At this point, in 1944 and 1945, the Air Force of the Land of the Rising Sun suffered heavy casualties. The Japanese Air Force had to go on the defensive more and more, and the Americans kept having them achieved air supremacy in the Pacific Rim. A huge number of Japanese pilots lost their lives in the dogfights in those years. During this phase of the Pacific War, the Japanese Air Force was slowly running out of ammunition and fuel. For this reason, the Japanese Vice Admiral Tatsuro Atsuki formed the first unit of kamikaze aviators. The goal of this special unit was the destruction of the enemy ships through the frame in a nosedive. For this purpose, bombs were mounted on the kamikaze plane, under the plane, and in the pilot's cabin. To recruit the kamikaze pilots, those were selected who had made special achievements in the war years 1941 to 1944, and sent them letters. These letters began with a single question. Do you want to become a kamikaze, become the divine wind? But the question was formulated in such a way that the reader was portrayed as a coward if the answer was no, which was considered a disgrace to Imperial Japan. If the reader of this recruitment letter answered yes, his family received large sums of money from the state, and from then on the family was held in high public esteem. Thus, the kamikaze pilot was considered on par with a divine office in Imperial Japan. The Japanese have, within the context of Bushido, which translates the way of the warrior, which dates back to the days of the samurai. In your structure of society, captivity was viewed as something absolutely unacceptable. This structure gave the special unit of the kamikaze the social foundation, and the very positive public image in society of Japan at the time of World War II. In the last 8 months of the war, the kamikaze slowly ran out of planes. The Japanese industry produced airplanes, which were of lower quality than the previous years. The goal was, that the plane should do, was just fly to its destination, to frame it in the dive. For example, the aircraft model Nakashima Ki-115. The landing gear was not retracted after takeoff, but just faded away, that it was a one-way suicide flight anyway, and the pilot was nowhere should land. In addition, prototypes of a jet-powered aircraft were made in the last months of the Second World War used by the kamikaze, such as the Jukusuko-type aircraft. These planes were mounted on top of the large Japanese bomber planes, and were sounded a few kilometers in front of the American ships. These kamikaze aircrafts were carried the kilometers to their destination by their own rocket propulsion. At this point, the Japanese Navy Air Force was trying to produce anything that could possibly fly, just so these flying undergrounds could transport the kamikaze pilot with his deadly payload to the target. In the eyes of the Japanese government, the kamikaze pilot had to die in action. If the kamikaze pilot happened to survive somehow, he and all his relatives were charged with public disgrace. But there was one exception. The pilot could and had to survive if his plane couldn't carry him to the enemy ship. Just so next time, he could make a fresh attempt at a suicide flight. Got down in history in a very interesting case. Kamikaze pilot Sergeant Yamamura missed his target 3 times and returned to base. He also survived an American bombardment. The 4th time, a plane was carried by a Japanese bomber. But the bomber was attacked by American fighters, shot down and began the descent. The release mechanism jammed, and Yamamura was unable to separate his plane from the bomber. So the kamikaze pilot could not reach his goal for the 4th time, and was able to save himself by parachuting. The unsuccessful kamikaze aviator Yamamura survived, and did not launch any kamikaze flights until the end of the war. In truth, the suicide flights of the kamikaze were very effective. These attacks sent about 90 U.S. Navy ships to the bottom of the sea. In addition, about 50,000 ships of the U.S. Navy were seriously damaged by the kamikaze attacks. In addition, one must consider that a large part of the kamikaze was shot down by American fighters or anti-aircraft guns before they have reached their destination. Also of note is the fact that the kamikaze attacks have taken a great moral toll on the American armed forces. An interesting fact is that among the kamikaze were not only pilots but also submarine pilots, which was the submarine filled with explosives underwater close to a large enemy ship. By the end of the Pacific War, kamikaze pilots and submarine pilots were mostly recruited from the younger generation. The average age of these young men was around 20 years old. Raised in the code of the ancient samurai, these young men went, with great joy in the suicidal flights of the kamikaze. The Japanese of that time celebrated them as great heroes, who with honor have fulfilled their wages for the Japanese nation. The Japanese kamikaze pilots are said to have flown between 2,500 and 2,800 attacks in the last years of the war in 1944 and 1945. Only about 14% of kamikaze pilots survived these attacks. What was dangerous in the crash was not the bomb or the explosives from the kamikaze plane but the oozing fuel dangerous. This seeped through passages and shafts under the enemy ship's deck, where it spread and caught fire. So the enemy ships exploded from the inside out, because the ammunition stored below deck exploded. That was it today for the Japanese kamikaze in World War II. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please leave a subscription and a thumbs up. See you soon, your channel History Best.